I'm continuing with my series of talks that I've prepared for the day school I'm running in Brussels later in March. This is the first of 3 parts that I'm devoting to modern communist principles as applied to the political economy of communism. Unless otherwise stated, statistics and graphs that I use in this presentation have been prepared by me, and they're drawn from a forthcoming book, How the World Works, which should be coming out in a year or so from Monthly Review. I'm going back to 1847 to start out with, when Engels wrote The Principles of Communism. In that he said that communists ally with democratic socialists, people who later came to be called social democrats, because democratic socialists favour the same measures that the communists advocate, not as part of the transition to communism, but as measures which they believe will be sufficient to abolish the misery and evils of present-day society. So what were these common principles shared by socialism and communism? They now go on to where communist and socialist principles diverge. Engels' principles of communism in 1847 were the following: the limitation of private property through progressive taxation and heavy inheritance taxes, gradual expropriation of the capitalist class, partly through compensation in the form of bonds and partly through competition with more efficient state industry, employment in publicly owned land, factories and workshops, an equal obligation on all members of society to work, the centralization of money and credit in the hands of the state through a national bank with state capital, and the suppression of all private banks, the gradual increase in the number of factories, workshops, railroads and ships that are owned by the state, the education of all children in state boarding schools, construction of on public lands of great palaces as communal dwellings for associated groups of citizens engaged in both industry and agriculture, and combining in their way of life the advantages of urban and rural conditions. Now some of those, the ones I've shown in black, have been shared by Social Democrats, and to a greater or lesser extent the Social Democrats have attempted to achieve these. The ones that are in red go beyond what the Social Democrats have achieved. And the last 2 points have not been carried out even by any of the communist governments, unless you say that the communes in China were a first step towards the construction on public lands of great palaces as communal dwellings. The great palaces were not built. Now the key economic goals of the democratic socialists and the communists had a big overlap. 100 years later, in the 1940s, the Labour Party in Britain was putting most of the black policies into practice. The ones that the Social Democrats have only partially met were the full socialisation of childcare and development of communal palace garden dwellings. And as I say, even communist governments held back on these. Let's move on a century, not to social democracy, but to where communist governments were in power. In 1949, 102 years after Engels, Stalin set down what he saw the essential principles of socialism were: the dictatorship of the proletariat and a workers' and peasant state, socialised property of the main instruments and means of production, expropriation of all the large factories and their management by the state, nationalisation of all capitalist banks and the merging of them into a single state bank, and the strict regulation of its functioning by the state, the scientific and planned conduct of the national economy from a single centre, from each according to his capacity, to each according to his work, distribution of the material good depending on the quality and quantity of work done by each person, obligatory domination of Marxist-Leninist ideology, armed forces that allow the defence of the revolution, and ruthless suppression of counter-revolutionaries. The red points go beyond Engels' common principles and are specifically new communist measures. You will not have got any social democratic government agreeing to this. What was the context of Stalin listing these? It was in the context of discussions with the Chinese communists who were proposing a socialism with Chinese characteristics, as it's now called. And he was saying, no, there are no national characteristics of socialism. These are the universal characteristics. But note that Stalin is saying these are characteristics of socialism. He's not saying these are characteristics of communism. But when you look at them, they actually go beyond what Engels listed as characteristics of socialism. In the rest of this talk and the next two talks, I'm going to focus on what the red lines were. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the scientific and planned conduct of the national economy from a single centre, and the principle of from each according to his capacity to each according to his work, and how those can be achieved in the 21st century. We have to learn from history. Prior to the actual establishment of socialist economies, the economic principles on which they would operate could only be thought of in terms that people familiar with capitalist economy could relate to. So Engels' demands were all concrete measures that were understandable in the 19th century. Experience of 30 years of revolution enabled Stalin to go further. There is no mention of centralized planning by Engels. That was an innovation that came about through the actual experience of running a socialist economy. But learning from history cuts both ways. From the 1950s, limitations of the Soviet concept of communism began to show. The Communist Party in the Soviet Union had originally been the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. And Soviet communism retained a number of conceptual hangovers from social democracy, from the democratic socialists that Engels was talking about. One of them was on the question of money, and there is another one which is less evident, but was on the question of communism being seen just in terms of abundance. And this is a characteristic trait of democratic socialism or social democracy, that achieving abundance is by itself seen as a key. Now, there are critical problems with that, which I'll go into. If we look at the difference between hitherto existing socialism and capitalism, and these are the actual features of them, not the speculations that people had prior to these systems coming into existence. Key feature of capitalism was the commodity production of all goods. Socialism had a commodity form of consumer goods, but not all goods. Capitalism had private ownership. Socialism had public ownership. Both had wage labour, but capitalism had market anarchy, whereas socialism had planning. Now there are common features here, and there are contradictory features. Common feature there was wage labour. Every other line here, there is a difference. Now, the section I quoted from Stalin related to socialism. But Stalin, in his Economic Problems of Socialism, which was written a few years later, set forward what he saw the relationship to be between socialism and communism. And it's worth comparing the view of it that Soviet orthodoxy, starting from Stalin, had, and the view that's actually given by Marx. They're not the same. Both agree that you start off from capitalism. After that, Marx talks of a first stage of communism, in which there's no commodities or money, there's no private owners, there's payment in labour tokens according to physical work done, and there is a tax on labour incomes. This is set out in the Critique of the Gotha programme. The model that the Soviet Union had was that after capitalism you have socialism. And this is mistakenly identified with Marx's first stage of communism. And this is a sliding together of the two things, which has its origins in the Soviet Communist Party originally having been a social democratic party, and the Social Democrats tended to elide the difference between socialism and communism. In this, commodities and monies are kept. You have state plus cooperative ownership, and say you don't have entirely... A co-op ownership is a form of semi-private ownership. You have payment in money wages, not payment by labour tokens, according to work done and also according to status, so that male jobs were paid more than female jobs. And public services, instead of being met by a tax on labour incomes, which Marx always called for, were met by a sales tax. This may seem a minor point, but I'll show that this actually led to critical distortions in the economy. Marx then said there's a second stage of communism when you get payment according to need, and that large families get higher incomes because they have greater needs, and that people who are disabled get additional payments because they have greater needs. What does Stalin say? He says, okay, commodity production will be abolished and replaced by what is translated in the English edition of Economic Problems of Socialism as a product exchange. Speaking to a Russian friend, he said that the same word is used for barter in Russian as the word that is translated as product exchange in the English edition of Economic Problems of Socialism. So he is saying commodity production will be replaced by barter, free distribution of many goods, and full state ownership. Now, this has many properties in common with Marx's first stage of communism, but it doesn't have the system of labour tokens or calculation in labour time, which is a key feature in Marx's economic theory. Then let's say, why didn't the USSR actually reach the communism that it was aiming for? If we look at the 1960 program of the CPSU. It is very centered around this principle of abundance. The material and technical basis of communism will be built up by the end of the second decade, that's say 1971 to 1980, to ensure an abundance of material and cultural values for the whole population. Soviet society will come close to the stage where it can introduce the principle of distribution according to needs, and there will be gradually a transition to one form of ownership, public ownership. Thus a communist society will in the main be built in the USSR, and the construction of communist society will be fully completed in the subsequent period, meaning after 1980. It's a very optimistic timetable. They were hoping to overtake the USA by 1980, and in many key areas it was actually achieved. But it's important to note that the transition is seen solely in terms of quantity of output, not in terms of changed social relations. Following Lenin, it gives great emphasis, this program, on electrification. It says electrification, which is the pivot of the economic construction of communist society, plays a key role in the development of all economic branches and in the effecting of all modern technological progress. It is therefore important to ensure the priority of the development of electric power output. This is following Lenin, where he says communism is Soviet power plus electrification of the whole country. So, how did it actually succeed with this? I have here figures I've computed for the amount of gigawatt hours produced in different countries, in different times. I've taken the USSR in 1990. It produced 1728000 gigawatt hours of electricity. Now this is clearly not as much as China, US or the EU produce now. But these countries have larger populations, or these federations have larger populations. And you can normalize it into how much human labour equivalent per head was it. Because electricity can substitute for human energy, for human labour. And we can say how many human worker equivalents was there per head of population in the form of electricity in these countries. And you can see that the USSR in 1990, whilst it was not as advanced as the USA, it only produced about half as much power per head, was actually already ahead of where the EU is now, where China is now. China is now caught up with the EU, and it was slightly ahead of Great Britain in 2014. Just for contrast, I've put in where Great Britain was at the start of the 20th century, and that is the total amount of artificial power, including steam engines, not just electricity, available in Britain at the time. Now look at food production. If we compare the Soviet Union with Brazil, the United Kingdom and the USSR, and look at the key elements of high protein food, we can see that it comfortably outproduced the two capitalist countries in eggs, in milk and in meat. Why do I choose the UK and the USSR? I choose the UK because it was the leading capitalist country at the time the Soviet Union was formed, and I choose Brazil because it was a capitalist country at the same level of development as the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was formed. Now, clearly there were lots of food was being produced. If communism was a matter of abundance, Here we have the Soviet Union producing more electricity and more food than the leading capitalist countries. Was that enough food for communism? The problem in many ways with the Khrushchev program was it projected forward the exponential growth rates which the Soviet Union had been achieving during the 1940s and 50s, and predicted these forward right to 1980. And this didn't actually happen. It assumed you'd have an exponential growth like this. In fact, for any industry that you look at in an industrial society, its growth takes an S-curve shape. In the early years it looks as if it's exponential, and then it levels off. It's what's known as a logistic curve. And his model of communism downplayed social change. He does say that there will be no classes, socio-economic and cultural distinctions and living conditions between town and countryside will disappear. The countryside will raise to the level of development of the town in productive forces and the nature of work, the forms of production relations and living conditions and well-being of the population. So to an extent they talk about social relations. They talk about social relations in that the cooperatives in the countryside were going to be replaced by state farms. But the concrete program gave no measures to abolish classes or abolish money and commodities. When the impossibility of continued 10% growth began to be felt, made itself felt, this was seen within the USSR as a failure of communism, since communism had been predicated on the continuation of this exponential growth. If society was not moving forward, it failed to morally inspire people. And by the late 1980s, 10 years after communism was supposed to have been achieved, communists could not resist the pressures from capitalist ideology because they were no longer achieving vastly greater rates of economic growth than the capitalist West. This was then seen as a fundamental failure. There are a set of contradictions within late Soviet society. One was the problem of economic calculation, another was the failure to apply the law of value, and another was the corrupting effect of money and the black economy. And I'll go into discussing those in my next talk.